Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Middleton Chambers September On Track session. We are pleased to welcome all of you and have you joining us today virtually. A few notes as we get started. So it's maybe been a minute since we've done a Zoom. So just please, we would ask that you keep your microphone on mute. We will have an opportunity at the end to take yourself off and ask questions. In the meantime, we can utilize the chat feature for anything that's coming to top of mind to make sure that we don't forget or we can answer right away. And would love to see any of those bright smiling faces out there if you're able to turn your camera on. So I want to give a shout out to today's sponsor. A big thank you to Upper Iowa University for helping sponsor this program. We appreciate their support, absolutely. And I would be happy to introduce today's speaker, Jason Willborn. He is the president of SustainableHR PEO, which is a division of the Co-op CPA group. Jason is, as I said, president, has over 15 years of experience and is here to talk all about handbooks. So Jason, I will turn it over to you.
The most exciting topic ever on a Tuesday afternoon. All right, so I will be going over the employee handbook, the what, why, how, and who. And we're on track to be a great presentation because it switched. All right, so creating and implementing an effective employee handbook, which we all want in our organizations. So today's agenda is going to be an introduction on myself. What is an employee handbook? Then we'll move into why do you need an employee handbook for your organization? How to create an employee handbook, who should be involved in your organization, best practices and tips, sample employee handbooks worth reviewing, and there are a couple good ones. And then we'll have a Q&A session like Kristen said at the end. And then I'll also have my contact info if you want to contact me. All right, so Kristen kind of took this away. So I'm Jason Willborn, president of SustainableHR with, I guess, over 15 years of experience. That's kind of scary to say. So enough about me and on to the presentation. All right, so what is an employee handbook? An employee handbook is a comprehensive document outlining company policies, procedures, and expectations. The purpose of that handbook is to basically communicate guidelines, maintain consistency, and ensure compliance. So what's nice about that is basically the employees in your organization knows that regardless of the policy, it's going to be administered the same way for everybody within your organization. So I always say best practice is when that employee comes onto your team, their first week, even their first day, to meet with them, present them with the handbook up front, give them time to review it so that when during you have your, basically your onboarding presentation, you're talking about benefits, at that point, they have the opportunity to ask questions as well. Because if you just give somebody an employee handbook, typically they're not going to read it because it's not the most exciting handbook. So by, giving them time, letting them know that you're going to be asking them questions, hopefully they take a little bit of time to review some policies, ask questions. It can be an interactive discussion between the two of you. So topics include typically employment at will in Wisconsin and many other states. What's important about that is you never want to talk about that it's an employment contract. It's truly just a document that ensures that policies and procedures are basically administered correctly and consistently. It also includes compensation and benefits, time off and leave, safety and security information as well. So why do you need an employee handbook? Obviously, it's important because having an employee handbook is that first thing typically people see in your organization. So those typically include your mission statement, your values. What's important about that is that typically is what kicks off that employee handbook, that's something that that employee wants to read. So depending on your organization, it's going to look different if it's an accounting company versus an IT company, even versus a startup. You want to make sure that it fits your company culture because not every handbook is going to make sense in a different organization. How it helps meet legal requirements. So one important thing, if you take away anything from this conversation, is once an employee starts with your company, that you present them with the handbook and you make sure that they acknowledge that they've basically received a copy of it and it's up to them to read it. Why that's important is if you get yourself into a legal situation, typically that's going to be the first document you need to present to unemployment or to an attorney if it goes that route, because they're going to say, did the employee receive a copy of their handbook? And by making sure that you have that document right, during that first week, that ensures that you are good to go. Enhances communication between the organization and employees. So when basically you're putting together a handbook, you not only want to, of course, make sure it hits HR standards, make sure that it's legally compliant in the states that you're operating in, but you also want to make sure that the managers, the directors, and then even get a little bit of employee feedback to ensure that it hits, every point in your company. And then shaping and reinforcing company culture. So I always say, read it, review it, and then read it one more time, not when you're at work, and see if that's what you want to hit. 10 years ago, those handbooks look completely different than what they do today. So, I've seen a lot of handbooks in 15 years, and, a lot of handbooks back in the day always ended every policy with up to and including termination. Is that the way you want to write policies? Does that make the employee want to read that handbook? Is it employee focused? Is that sending the right message? Nowadays, definitely not. You want to make sure that, people are working in a remote environment, people are working in the office. You don't want that handbook to come across that, hey, this book is just used for discipline. You want to make sure that it's truly something that people can go back to, reference, this is the way we do things for this procedure, and then go from there. So benefits of an employee handbook, clear expectation and guidelines. So what's nice about an employee handbook is, typically that first week when HR is meeting with them or the manager is meeting with them, you can go through that handbook and you can set the clear expectations. This is the mission of the company. This is our values. Here's our expected work times. So a lot of handbooks lately that I have reviewed and my team has reviewed even is, like hours of work, for example. With a remote workforce, with people being in the office, it's just, a lot of organizations is, hey, just, come in, do what you want. As long as the work gets done, you're good to go. There's no real expectations in the handbook of here's our core working hours. Our core working hours are 8 to 5 o'clock. You need to be online, you need to be available. So making sure that you have those policies, procedures, you're open to receive team messages, you're open to receive emails, that sets the standard so that those employees know what to expect. You can always change that later on if you're like, hey, let's not make it 8 to 5, we want to make it 10 to 4. You can definitely do that. That handbook is a working document, so you can always alter it accordingly. I always say best practice is to review that handbook, typically once a year, for sure every 2 years. Don't leave it for 10 years and then go back and alter it. You're going to have a lot of work to do. Uniform application of policies. So you want to make sure that they're written consistently and that you're able to administer those the same way for an employee all the way up to a vice president. So by making sure that that's written consistently, you're able to also, tell your workforce, regardless if it's an employee all the way up to a VP, it's going to be handled that same way. Define roles and responsibilities. So what's important about that is as you're going through the policies and you're talking about best practices, this is, who's responsible for this. This is who's responsible for this at this level. And so it clearly defines what the employee is responsible for, what the supervisor is responsible for, and what the manager is responsible for. So let's say it's a situation where a employee needs some time off work. Typically at most organizations, they're going to go to their supervisor. If it's a larger organization, they're going to talk it over with their supervisor, tell them why they need some extended time off. That supervisor might not have the authority. So in that handbook, it should say, If the supervisor doesn't have authority, it needs to go to their manager of the department. That manager then would listen to the supervisor, take everything into account. It would be up to that manager then to make that decision. It would probably then go back to the supervisor and then back to the employee. But you have to make sure that you have well written out policies just in case something happens, that that next person who walks into that role can then consistently administer those. And that's even important, like, with the turnover nowadays. You have to make sure that you have standard operating procedures. So if somebody leaves, they can still walk into that position and everything continues as is. You're not going to drop anything because somebody leaves on your staff. It's going to be tough for a while, but you'll get through it. And then knowledge empowers employees. So with that handbook, you update it, let's say once a year, you talk with the employees on their first day, their first week, but that's also a document you should be reviewing. So maybe you have an annual meeting, maybe you have an outing once a year. Take tidbits from that employee handbook, discuss it because it is a living and breathing document. You don't have to, do a complete handbook rollout when you do updates, if it's minor updates, but it is something that, definitely employees should re-acknowledge on a periodic basis, just so that they get in front of that employee handbook. So how to create an employee handbook. If you don't have one, I'm happy to discuss with you, obviously, a template that you can start with. But the first thing to consider is start with clear goals. What do you want that handbook to go over? 10 years ago, like I said, it's going to look completely different. That handbook 10 years ago was something that included absolutely everything. It might have, had benefits in it. It might have had FMLA, all that stuff. Since stuff changes so much every year, I truly don't think benefits should even be included in it anymore. That's a whole different document, especially with vendors changing on a consistent basis. That's one thing that you don't have to completely update your handbook for. That can be a completely different benefits guide, I call it. And then that keeps you from having to update that handbook. But what do you want to basically have? Do you want it to express your mission, your vision statement, what you're looking for in the environment? Do you have fun? All that good stuff. You can clearly spell that out. You can get your policies and procedures, how you administer leave, all the way through to basically offboarding that employee. Determine what to include. So that's going to vary by organization. Like I said, that's going to look completely different for a startup versus an IT company versus a biotech company. But determine what to include. Typically, that is going to have your mission statement, your vision statements, your FLSA, compensation. It might touch on benefits, such as this is what makes you benefits eligible. This is how we do company equipment, working remote. This is our policy when it comes to AI. That's a hot topic right now. What do you let your employees release to those AI platforms? How to write and format the employee handbook. Like I said, you can find templates all over the internet for that. Some are better than others, but truly starting that off on the right foot. So making sure you have a table of contents. I always give a little bit of history on the organization just to set that groundwork. When the employee starts to read it, go into why we're in business, and then start with the FLSA, core working hours, benefits of the organization, if there's background checks, when that's administered, driving policies, and then of course, all the required policies that you have to have by state. The importance of multiple reviews. Typically HR starts the handbook, but that's where you really have to get the right people. Include the directors, managers, who is going to be looking at that handbook on a consistent basis when it comes to department heads, because they're the ones that typically have to look at that handbook, um, become familiar with those policies, and then express those to the employees. So, it truly is a whole organization that needs to look at that handbook and make sure that it works for that organization that they're working in. And then how to finalize and share with the employees. So I always recommend you roll it out to the directors, the VPs, the supervisors first. You get their thoughts and processes. I should say thoughts and takeaways. From that takeaway, you go back, revise it if needed, you go back to them one more time, and then finally you can roll it out to the employees. Either a detailed email, letting them review it first, and then having a time that you all meet, they can ask questions and then sign off on that document. Otherwise, have a company meeting, go through the main policies that employees might have questions about, let them review the others, give them a time frame to ask questions, and then of course have a deadline to capture that acknowledgement. And then contents of an employee handbook. Like I said, welcome and introduction, that sets the groundwork for a successful handbook. Employment policies that you have to have by state. It is going to look different from Wisconsin versus even Illinois, California. Code of conduct, what you expect from your employees. Benefits, compensation, and development. Very, very brief on benefits. Like I said, let's say it's benefit eligibility. So full-time, 30 hours a week or more, part-time, 29 hours a week or less, that does not make you benefits eligible. Just keep it short and sweet. Compensation, you can discuss how you lay out compensation, discussing bonuses, salary structure, stuff like that. You can lay that out in the handbook if you choose. That might be something else you want to list out, is like 401k match, for example, or you might have a profit sharing, you can write that in, but I wouldn't detail out exactly how that works. And then development. So how do you build your employees? How do you give them training? Can they go out and get their CPP? Can they go out and get their CPA? What part of that will you pay? What does that do to their salary? Stuff like that. Working hours, like I said, this has changed greatly with COVID. Spelling that out clearly is always good, especially with remote workforce, people in the office, making sure that that's consistent. Time off and leave policies, that can vary by state, so that can get tricky depending where they live. For example, in Illinois, you have to pay out vacation if they leave, but if it's unlimited PTO, you do not. So making sure that that's consistent and that you can apply it correctly. Also, when it comes to like policies working remote, making sure that you can administer that consistently, such as this group of employees cannot work remote, but this group of employees can work remote. You have to make sure that you set that expectation up front. Otherwise, you're going to get lots of questions when you roll out that handbook. Safety and security is always a big one. I always say, make sure that that makes sense. So a lot of us have security badges, making sure that you include that. Hey, if you don't see somebody walking around with a security badge, ask them who they are, make sure that they're supposed to be in the building. When it comes to security, do you have policies on where you can log in? Can they log in coffee shops? Do they have to use the VPN? What do they do with their laptop if they're traveling? Everything like that, that you want to make sure that your organization is safe. And then employee resignation and terminations, making sure that that policy specifically talks about what is your recommendation. Like, should they give a 2-week notice? Is it a 4-week notice? What does that look like? What does that offboarding typically include? Is it talking to HR, talking about COBRA documentation? What does that handoff look like to other employees? Who should be involved? Like I said, that's the role of typically HR, management, and select employees within that organization. So making sure that all levels of basically the organization is involved. That's going to make sure that that handbook is successful, that you can administer it, and it's going to be received the way you want it to be received in your organization. And then emphasizing the need for collaboration by having everybody at the table talking about policies. That's even when it goes to that first glance after you produce it, making sure that everybody understands the policies, why they're there. It could even be like, listening to music in the workplace. Why can't I, have a speaker right at my desk? Well, it's gonna annoy everybody else possibly. So here's why you have to wear headphones. Here's why you need to do this. Just making sure that everybody is in agreement for best practice. And then if there is a disagreement, making sure that majority understands, and then you can work with the individuals that don't totally agree and come to a collaboration on that. So on this slide, I basically put the required Wisconsin employee handbook policies and spelled them out. I know that Kristen's going to send out this slide deck later, so I thought this would be nice for reference. But a couple policies you have to have in your Wisconsin employee handbook is civil air patrol policy. That's going to apply for 11 or more employees. The day of rest law, work week, and work schedules policies, that's primarily for factories and mercantile establishments. Election official leaves, typically that's an unpaid leave of absence. FMLA, obviously that's for companies 50 or more employees. Now, if you're not 50 or more employees, you can still have a leave off policy. You could have, if you're going out on leave for pregnancy, for example, for something major, you're going to pay up to, let's say, 6 weeks of leave. You can still have, a leave of absence policy without being FMLA eligible. Jury duty and or witness duty leave, that's where employees are basically called for jury or witness duty. Typically how I've seen it administered is if you're one of the people that have to go, you get a very minute check for serving. You basically sign that over to the organization and you just get paid your same wages. So pretty simple to add that. Meal and rest breaks, this is going to be for employees under the age of 18, just lists out how often they need to take meal and lunch breaks. Organ and bone marrow donor leave. So this is also for companies 50 or more, standard language for that. Volunteer firefighter, emergency medical services practitioner, medical responder, or ambulance driver. That's an important one. So, if they're late or absent and they are working with one of these, you cannot discipline them in any way. It's just like they were on time because they're doing their service. And then voting leave, 3 consecutive hours to vote. So those are just the required policies that you have to have in your employee handbook.
Jason, before we leave that slide, what is a mercantile establishment? Does that include like restaurants or retail shops?
Correct. Yep.
Both?
You're exactly
Okay.
correct. Yep. And then optional Wisconsin employee handbook policies, you'll probably have to blow this one up unless you have really good vision. But background check policy, how those are administered. Another big one is business expense policies. When do you have to submit those business expenses? Is it within 30 days? Is it within by the quarter? Making sure you spell that out. Dress code policy, might not be as important as it was. Most people are dressed for your workday now. Use common sense. If you're meeting with a client, dress up. If you don't have meetings for the day, you can dress more casual. Exit interview policy, that's another good one to have. Another policy that's gaining speed, I'm sure everybody has heard about it on TV or the internet, is AI. So what can and can you not share with ChatGPT? They can go as in depth of, hey, you can write an article, you can throw it into ChatGPT, it'll make it look amazing. Do you disclose that? So do you have to say, hey, I use ChatGPT for this? Or another one that I found kind of scary was financials. You can throw basically your balance sheet in ChatGPT. It'll take it out 10 years based on recommendations, and it'll tell you exactly how it works. Is it totally secure where you want to put your whole company's financial data on the internet? I'm not so sure about that. So this is why these policies are coming up and everything's moving in lightning speed for that. So it's going to be one that you have to consistently update. Social media policy is another big one. What can and cannot your employees post on Facebook, TikTok, about the company? And then telecommuting, obviously, what's your policy on that? Making sure you can administer it consistently across all individuals in your organization. And there was another one. Workplace violence policy is another big one that is definitely picking up speed and making sure that you have in the handbook. All right, so best practices and tips. Best practices for drafting and maintaining the handbook. Just because you create the handbook, you can't stop looking at it. It is a living and breathing document in your organization. So as policies change, as you grow from, let's say, 5 to 10 workers to 100 workers, when you become not FLSA, FMLA eligible, and other policies change, especially across organizations. The overtime policy might be changing soon. All of that, you need to update your handbook. So I've seen organizations that, hey, we created a handbook, we haven't touched it in 10 years. Please don't do that. Please make sure you review it every couple years. That's best practice. That's how you make sure that employees want to look at your handbook. And then even as your culture changes, your culture in your business isn't probably going to look the same in 10 years. So you want to make sure that the language in your handbook is consistent. And if, the culture has changed, make sure you reflect that in your vision and culture statement. And then a handbook that employees want to read. There's a couple that I'll note in the next couple slides that, if you're wanting to add a little bit of pizzazz to your handbook, there's like 4 that you should look at. I know that sounds weird, but they are pretty good. That they actually do want you to read them, or like they have like a slide deck on their employee handbook. So it's completely different, but they're kind of engaging actually. All right, so 4 sample employee handbooks worth reviewing, like I said, is Nordstrom, number 1. So their handbook is a single card, and it basically says use good judgment in all situations. So they're basically empowering their employees to make that customer happy. They trust that their employees are going to do what it takes. Valve is another one. It touches on everything from the company philosophy to walking new hires through their first day of employment. Pretty much exactly what we want every handbook to do. Trello uses their own platform, and they call their handbook the employee manual. It's interactive, user-friendly, and engaging. And that's, something else you can use. You could definitely do like a Loom video. That's something that we've implemented here is when we go through benefits, when we go through the handbook, we have a very interactive Loom video. It has one of the HR representatives right in the corner. We let the employees review it, and then we come in and they have their opportunity to ask questions. It gives it a little bit more pizzazz than having to read a 30-page handbook via paper. And then the Zappos culture book, they call it. It's a company's dedication to workplace culture, information on the company values, and they have testimonials from actual employees that work there. So another way that they add interaction, they make employees want to read it. So handbook essentials, as a reminder, employee handbooks are not contracts. Never say that this is a contract. It's going to get you in trouble. Like I said, most states are at-will employers. Employees can go as they please. Employers can dismiss employees as they please. I always recommend you have a reason and you have documentation, but truly, we are at will states. Employees should sign and acknowledge of receiving that handbook. 100% very vital. If you get yourself in a situation, that is the first thing somebody's going to ask for is, did they acknowledge the handbook and the policies and procedures that you set on their first day? You should disclaim that the handbook is a comprehensive statement of all your company's policies, but also you want to make sure that you acknowledge that this handbook is going to change over time, because as your organization grows, like I said, your handbook is going to grow. Reserve the right to update and amend the employee handbook. Reserve the right to bypass progressive discipline. So why this is important is, let's say Kristen's not coming to work on time. I'm sure that never happens, but if she didn't, that progressive discipline is going to look completely different than if it's myself and I'm stealing company property. You don't want to say in your handbook, hey, we're going to start out with a verbal, progress to a written, go to a final, and then move to termination. Because if you have that stated and you can bypass progressive discipline, you're basically opening yourself up to, well, I can steal company equipment, but I still get a verbal warning the first time. I don't think any of us would do that. So make sure that you have it documented that you can bypass progressive discipline. And then the bottom line is basically just make sure that you can administer all the policies and procedures correctly. Make sure that you open that up so that when employees read that handbook. It lays out your mission, your values, why it's an important handbook to read. And then typically employees will review that and make sure that, hey, this is how we typically administer policies consistently within our organization. So conclusion, tailor your handbook to your business. Employee handbooks are not contracts. Mitigating risk begins with communicating expectations. If you set the employee up for success, typically they will be successful. And then always obtain written acknowledgments from all employees. And if you're still with us and smiling, now's your time to ask questions.
Thank you, Jason. As he said, if anybody wants to take themselves off of mute and ask a question, please feel free. Otherwise, we can read them from the chat as well. I guess I'll go first. Jason, so you said something about like you could read the handbook together with an employee, which sounds torturous if it's long.
It does. It does.
Or like if you let them read it separately, you always recommend then getting back together with them and like pointing out the highlights, even if they acknowledge it?
Yep. So when I say going over the handbook, I don't mean page by page. Typically, the way you do it is you have, should you say more important policies rather than others? So it might be core working hours, for example. We expect you to be ready and available from 9 to 5. When requesting time off, we request a 2-week notice if possible to ensure we have enough people on staff to conduct everyday business. So just the top level policies and procedures. By all means, don't go through the employee handbook. That would be grueling, and that's not setting a good standard for the employee.
Kind of following up on that question, if we have we would give them a copy to review, and then you reconvene, go over any questions, point out key highlights, get their signature. Do they keep that copy, or could we keep a copy in a binder that's always available so that if there are updates, the most current version is what's always together?
Yep. So once they acknowledge it, I always recommend you keep the acknowledgement. Obviously, you can give them a copy of it though. For the employee handbook, a lot of organizations now have the technology. They can just keep it on a SharePoint, a OneDrive that they have access to. So just letting them know that, hey, you updated it. Here's the most updated version. You basically just need like an email to say, hey, we've made a couple changes. But if it's not a big update, I always say, then you don't need to do a complete rollout. So just let them know, hey, you've made some updates. You can lay out those updates. Obviously, if you want to have them re-sign it, you definitely can. That's best practice. But if it's not a huge update to anything that would make major litigation risk for you, then you don't have to get re-acknowledgements.
Thank you.
Me again. What about like confidentiality agreements? Are those part of a handbook, or is that like a separate thing, kind of like the benefits booklet?
Are you thinking like non-compete agreements or truly like confidentiality of company equipment, stuff like that?
Confidentiality.
I would put that in the handbook just because then you can get the sign off. So, don't disclose trade secrets, and you can list that all out. Don't disclose the technology we use. Don't include pricing. I would truly include that in the handbook. That pretty much stays pretty consistent. So you don't have to worry about having an outside document for that. And then
Okay.
you already have that acknowledgement. So if by chance they breach that policy, even when they leave, you still have it in writing that they acknowledged it in the handbook.
Perfect.
Your list of what you're required like by the state. I don't think we have, I shouldn't probably say that out loud. Everything in our handbook that's on the state, but you said under 50 employees have different rules. Will that be easy for me to find in a search from the state of Wisconsin? I was like looking at your leave of absence. If you're under 50 employees, you don't have to have a leave of absence.
You don't have to have it. It's always best practice you do. I mean, most organizations do. It is pretty simple to look that up though. Yeah, if you just Google it, you should be able to find it pretty easy. Yep.
All right. Anyone else have questions for Jason?
And of course, if you have questions, you can always email me, you can give me a call, and of course, Kristen has my contact information as well. So I'm happy to help. Obviously, we do provide that service as well. So if you need like a template, if you have questions, we're always happy to review handbooks as well. So it was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us. We appreciate you taking time out of your day. If you're looking forward to meeting Jason in person, he will be there at Sportoberfest tomorrow. So that's your hint that if you don't have a networking ticket, you should make sure you grab one.